It began at the dawn of 2007 with the forging of the first iPhone. The first expansion of the most popular MMO game was released, and Pirates of the Caribbean at World's End was showing at the cinema. But they were all of them deceived. For another game was made deep in the land of Westwood, Massachusetts, The Lord of the Rings: Shadows of Angmar, the 6th most selling game of the year behind the Sims 2 Bon Voyage expansion pack. Despite this rather embarrassing fact, I still think that Lord of the Rings Online is probably the most underrated MMO of all time, the original vanilla Lord of the Rings Online anyway. The game has been soured and spoiled by its brain-dead free-to-play model. The original LOTRO felt like an MMO way ahead of its time, since there were already some of the great and iconic features from WoW that were added in later expansions inside the base Lord of the Rings Online game. But what if you could turn back time? A time before cash shops, XP boosts, max level boosts, and a 1.5 year long and never-ending wait for new raid content, and go back to the original vanilla Lord of the Rings Online. Not a legendary server, a true classic Lord of the Rings Online experience. Alright guys, my name is MetaGoblin, and today I'm going to tell you about my adventures in the original Lord of the Rings Online Shadows of Angmar. Now this is made possible by the Echoes of Angmar private server project, which has given me a unique experience to go back and experience the game how it originally was. So grab yourself a beer, but obviously make sure it's a Belgian beer, put your feet up, and let's get into the video. So in this video we're going to be looking at how different vanilla Lord of the Rings Online was, with several key topics, them being class design, dungeons and raids, leveling, world design, social systems, professions, and PvP. And I will be making many comparisons here to vanilla World of Warcraft, as obviously the majority of my audience are World of Warcraft fans. So personally, I've always wanted to play Lord of the Rings Online because I'm a huge Lord of the Rings nerd, and there isn't really any half-decent open-world Lord of the Rings RPG game out there apart from War in the North, but that's not really an open-world game. And I find this very, very surprising because it's a world that could very easily breed a huge RPG franchise. The lore and world of Middle-earth could be mined for video game IPs, but instead we get monstrosities like the dog's dinner that was Rings of Power. In fact, I think I'd rather actually eat dog food than rewatch that show. I've been following the Echoes of Angmar project ever since that man Bear J mentioned it while I was watching one of his streams, and since then I have played most of the stress tests and the open beta very extensively, trying out a number of different classes and getting lost in this amazing journey. What's very interesting about classes in Lord of the Rings Online is they are designed very differently to World of Warcraft. Most MMOs don't really do anything very creative with class design, they just follow the main archetypes, the warrior, the mage, and the rogue. I mean, fair enough, some MMOs do put the boat out a little bit. But Lord of the Rings class design is different from the ground up. While like many other MMOs usually use the Holy Trinity system, tanks, healers, and DPS. LOTRO has tanks, DPS and healers, but another very important spoke on the wheel, the support role, and there are various different kinds of support roles. Support roles that focus on buffing, some of them focus on debuffing, and then some focus on the setups and just generally a bit of both. And these are extremely important classes because the content in LOTRO is much more challenging than anything you will see in classic WoW. These buffs and debuffs are needed. Every class is very, very unique and brings a very unique aspect to a group. There's a lot of class identity in LOTRO, and it really feels like each individual class stands out way more than any other MMO that I have played. The Captain, for instance, is primarily a buffing class with off-heals similar to the Shadow Priest's Vampiric Embrace in World of Warcraft. For instance, he has a companion called a Herald, who is essentially a barrier carrier that, when summoned, increases the stats of the party. The Captain also has buffs to increase the party's crit or to provide AoE off-healing. They also provide marks, which are a debuff causing beneficial effects to other players who attack the marked target. Kind of similar to Leader of the Pack in World of Warcraft, the Feral Druid talent. The Lawmaster focuses on weakening enemies, has very useful CC to make mob packs easier to deal with, and also a lot of off heals. The Burglar focuses more on debuffs that increase the damage that other parties deal to the target, and also has an on-demand Fellowship initiation ability. Now, I'm going to have to explain what Fellowship abilities are, because I've not seen anything like this in any other MMO either. Basically, the party can coordinate a special ability together. You have a red, blue, green or yellow button to press on the screen when a Fellowship ability is initiated, and different combos from different party members cause different effects. For instance, if everyone uses the red one, a giant ant will be summoned to do AoE damage. And if you do a certain combo of blue and green, AoE damage will be dealt and a ghost will be summoned. Then if you just use green, then everyone will get a very powerful heal over time effect. And there are many different combos to use. I think there's even a spider that you can summon at some point that applies debuffs to the enemy. Now, apart from these support classes, there are dedicated DPS, healer and tank classes. The Guardian is the tank, although we can DPS also. The Minstrel is the healer, again, who can also deal DPS. The Champion and the Hunter, now these are the big boy, big pumping, dedicated DPS classes. The Hunter being the best at single target DPS and the Champion being the best at AoE and cleave. Now the Guardian and the Minstrel can still perform a DPS role and level solo despite they are a dedicated tank and healer. They just have to build their character differently. Now this leads me on to deeds and traits, which are essentially your talent system in LOTRO. You see, later in LOTRO's lifetime, they switched to a more typical talent tree system like you do see in World of Warcraft, but I think this old system is actually quite interesting. In the game, there are deeds which are similar to the bonus objectives in Warlords of Draenor. You normally have to kill 90 of the same mob, and you are rewarded with bonus XP and a stat reward, and these stat rewards are called virtues, and there are 20 in total. These stats will provide you free stat bonuses usually, and can be stacked. For instance, the Discipline virtue provides might, disease resistance and reduction to melee damage taken. There are 5 slots for the different virtues that you want, so you actually have to go out into the world, explore the world and kill mobs in order to progress your character. You also have 5 specific class traits. Now these are earned by doing deeds, but this time using your class abilities for a certain amount of times. For instance, on my champion, I've used a swift attack 1000 times, and this gave me a trait that causes my swift attack to generate an extra favor point, basically combo points, and that happens whenever I crit. And there are other traits that are simple rewards for blocking attacks enough times. So it's a little like the Elder Scrolls game, where the more you use your abilities, the more powerful you are going to become over time. So there isn't just a basic XP system where the only source of progressing your character outside of gear is to just gain XP and get that character leveled up. There's other stuff to do in order to optimize your character, multiple different routes to take. And you can have 5 of these class traits equipped at once. There are also race traits that are normally utility focused or a bit gimmicky. For instance, I'm an elf and I have a stealth ability on a 60-minute cooldown. Despite the fact I am not playing a stealth class in this game, it is pretty cool because sometimes that does come in useful when I'm dealing with the open world. And I also have this little bonus: if I kill enough orcs, I'll get an extra hearthstone to Rivendell. There are also legendary traits that you unlock much higher level. These are new powerful abilities, for instance the Captain's Defy Corruption trait that causes his resurrection to res an additional player. These are unlocked by discovering class books in the game or by doing the level 50 class quest. In fact, there are many class quests in the game for every level bracket of 15, 30 and 50, and this is for every single class in the game. There's no favoritism for certain classes when it comes to class quests like there was in Vanilla WoW. These usually reward very good items for your class and another class trait that you can only get by doing the quest lines, and these are normally very adventurous long quest lines that will make you explore Middle-earth, and they will include story instances and dialogue where you get to meet some of the key characters from Lord of the Rings. For instance, as a burglar, you will get training from Bilbo Baggins, and as a captain, you'll get training from Boromir. You will still go to the class trainer to train abilities like you do in Classic WoW, but remember when as a warrior there's a quest to learn Berserker stance? Well, Lord of the Rings Online massively expands on that element. There are many creative ways that you can build and develop your character other than just gaining XP and visiting a class trainer. Now, one element people are probably most interested in are dungeons and raids, because this is probably what you're going to be doing most of your time at endgame. They are very differently designed in vanilla Lord of the Rings Online. There are less dungeons than vanilla WoW, but they are much longer and much more difficult. These are adventures that require a lot of prep and skill because they will take up a large chunk of your evening to complete, and obviously you don't want your time wasted. Dungeon groups require 6 people rather than the usual 5, because even the trash mobs are very beefy. The bosses themselves have much more mechanics than any classic WoW dungeon I've ever seen, probably the Molten Core. From what I've experienced so far, there's a lot of mechanics to dodge and lots of ad management to focus on. And the fights are extremely long for dungeon bosses. They feel like endurance fights. For instance, the first ever dungeon boss you'll experience in the Barrow Downs is over 3 minutes long. That's even longer than Nax bosses right now on Wrath of the Lich King Classic. It's very important to bring a good setup for these dungeons because power, which is essentially the mana stat in the game, is something to worry about. And other classes can provide extra efficiency to the group to reduce power problems and reduce the damage that the boss deals, and therefore that will require less healing from the minstrel. You really can't just cheese dungeons by stacking pumper DPS. You need a good balance of good DPS, but also those support classes we talked about earlier. Honestly, the difficulty I experienced in my first low level 24 dungeon in this game was more difficult than Molten Core. Now I know Molten Core is a pretty easy raid, but imagine Dead Mines being as difficult as Molten Core. We failed a few times on the second boss of Barrow Downs. That is a double boss fight, where hordes of zombie arms spawn and try and kill the healer. Fellowship abilities are very important in dungeons also. The group has to coordinate what colour ability to use in what order to get the desired effect. Without Discord, this can be very difficult, so it's usually the best strategy to pre-assign what colour you are going to press. Messing up this process can really gimp the group and could easily be the difference between you defeating the boss or not. Because if you mess up these fellowship combos, you basically just get a much worse version of the fellowship ability instead. When it comes to raids, I can only go off what experienced LOTRO players have told me. Because the Echoes of Angmar server is still in beta and the only content you can do is up to level 24. But it sounds like it's basically the exact same story for raids. The fights are much longer than what you are probably used to playing World of Warcraft, because they are more akin to mythic raid fight durations. And I've heard that raid fights can last 10 to 20 minutes long, and the difficulty is much more difficult than anything you're probably going to see in Classic WoW. Now let's talk about how leveling works in this game. In Classic WoW, you pick up quests, you complete them, and you grind mobs in the world or inside dungeons, and that's the main way you gain XP in this game. But LOTRO has many other sources of XP. It rewards you for playing the game differently. Firstly, the biggest source of XP is the main questline. This is a very story-focused questline that is literally done in books and chapters, and it's great at communicating the story of the game with an actual narrator who occasionally explains what's going on so you don't have to read the quest text. I don't think I've read any quest text in this game, and I understand what's going on in the story. The main questline is based on the story from the books very accurately. And I do genuinely feel like I am contributing and helping Frodo and the other hobbits get out of the Shire and safely into Bree. There's a lot of RP moments on the main quest, usually inside instanced areas. Now these are similar to the scenarios in Mists of Pandaria. They're almost like mini dungeons where you follow an NPC character and you kill mobs, and there's normally a boss at the end. Again, with lots of narration, voice acting and big speech bubbles, so you know what's going on without having to read quest text. These normally grant the most XP, but some of these mini dungeons are too difficult to do solo. You will have to find a party of other players to do it with. otherwise you can't progress the main storyline. Luckily, even once you've completed these mini dungeons, you can go back and help your friends with them. You will find that in this game there is a lot of group focused content. It's faster to level up in groups and with your friends. Now remember the elite quests in Vanilla WoW and those elite mob areas like Red Ridge Mountains, Stonewatch quest to kill Gaffel Zog the big orc dude, or Pinewood Village elite quests in Silverpine Forest. Well, in Lord of the Rings Online there's much more elite quests and elite zones like this, which non-provide great XP and loot rewards. And to be honest, even the non-group quests are fairly difficult to solo. Whenever you have a quest that requires you to kill mobs in some kind of goblin camp for instance, you're going to need help. Mobs social pull very easily, and running away from mobs is much more difficult because whenever you turn away from a mob, you are slowed permanently. The daze effect is much harder to avoid and much more brutal in this game. So the solo leveling experience can sometimes be very challenging, much more challenging than I've ever experienced from playing Classic WoW. But this is why I'm enjoying it so much, because the game encourages you to level up with friends and to make friends in the first place, or to join a kinship. Because playing MMOs with your friends and meeting new people to play it with is always the best and most fun way to play an MMO. There's also a number of extra ways you can gain XP. The mob slaying deeds like I mentioned earlier, but also exploration. If you explore a full zone you will get an extra XP reward, and if you discover certain ancient ruins within a zone. The world of LOTRO also feels very different to Vanilla WoW. Now Vanilla WoW was a gorgeous game, and it still is, but LOTRO wins when it comes to the attention to detail. The interior locations in this game feel much more alive, detailed and immersive. And I think this is mainly achieved with instancing. In WoW there is no instancing in the open world apart from dungeons and raids. Because these interior locations, like Hobbit Holes, the Bree Inn, the caves, are in their own instance, it allowed the devs to increase the level of detail inside. For instance, inside the Dwarf and Elf starting area cave, you can look down over this bridge and you can see pretty far into the distance, making it feel more realistic. And one of the story instances that goes deeper into a dwarven settlement under the mountain, the expanse of this area is gigantic compared to anything you will ever see in Classic WoW. It really makes you feel like you are in the mines of Moria or something. Overall, when you play LOTRO, it feels much more like a realistic world. Nothing ever feels like it's been scaled down to be easier to process into a video game, and therefore, let's be honest, quite immersion breaking. Just compare looking at Weathertop from a distance compared to Stonewatch in Red Ridge. Classic WoW has this more stylized fantasy look that some people may describe as cartoonish, but LOTRO feels more realistic. And the fact that these locations I'm exploring are real locations from the world of the Lord of the Rings, it really is just a godsend for any Lord of the Rings fan. Also, the major questing hubs and settlements in this game also feel huge. The open world itself is also very detailed. There's a number of different areas to fill in the space. The world never feels empty. There's lots of ruins, for instance, because this game is set in the lost realm of Arnor. There was once a big human kingdom here, but not much of that is left. So you do spend a lot of time discovering this lost realm. The Old Forest is also an interesting area. It's been deliberately designed so that you can very easily get lost. And there's big evil tree monsters there to kill you if you're not careful. There's a lot of caves, nooks and crannies to discover, and special interior locations, and you will be rewarded for your exploration like I mentioned earlier with XP rewards, titles and sometimes traits. It's really hard to put into words, but if we're going to be honest, this world is the most beautiful open world I've experienced for a long time, with lots of diversity of environments, and there's always something interesting around every corner you take. There's also a lot of open world chests and rare enemies that provide good loot. Again, you are getting rewarded for your exploration. They normally also have expensive crafting materials. For instance, there are crafting resources that are required to craft powerful items that only drop off rare mobs, meaning there's always a need to go out in the open world. Now, I've only made it to one capital city, Bree, but Bree alone feels to scale exactly like a medieval town would feel. The NPCs are always busy doing activities like tending to horses, or working at a blacksmith, adding to the immersion and realism that the player feels. There's also bards playing music at the inns, and this is also an NPC you actually go to customize your traits. The capital cities are the main social hubs where the various social systems are in place, like the auction house, kinship maker, fast travel to player housing, and it's generally where people will chill when they are forming or looking for a group. There's a big looking for group channel in the game and also a built-in looking for group finder. You can list yourself as someone looking for a group, for group questing or for specific dungeons, much like the LFG tool that they added in Wrath of the Lich King Classic, and you can also add a little note. You can form a kinship in the game, which is basically a guild. These kinships have kinship ranks that develop over time. For instance, after 10 days, you unlock the officer chat, and 30 days, kinship mail, and eventually the kinship house perk, which means that mailing items to kinship members is 50% cheaper. Bit like guild perks that were added in Cataclysm. Again, that was a feature in LOTRO in 2007, added way later in World of Warcraft. And for the RP fans, you can actually get special titles for having guilds entirely composed of certain races. For instance, if you have a dwarf kinship, officers of that guild can get the Seneschal, I think it's called, Seneschal title. There's also a standard friend list where you can see the precise date and time where your friends were last online, and there's also a very useful ignore feature. Now, professions are fairly similar to most other MMOs, apart from the fact that the crafts feel much more impactful, even at low level. If you're a weaponsmith, for example, the weapon you will make early on will probably be better than most of the loot that you're going to get from questing, apart from the big quest rewards that you're going to get at the end of quest chains. There's also the scholar profession that creates potions and scrolls to buff your party, and other professions that focus on making armor, bows, jewelry, and food, etc. You can pick what profession you want, and these professions have 3 vocations within the profession, but you can only pick one profession, although you are technically getting 3 professions at once that complement each other. There isn't as much freedom and customizability since you can't pick precisely what vocations you want, although the professions that you get are set to synergize each other anyway. It's just a much more simple and standardized system. PvP is also very unique in this game. You see, I think the original developers wanted to maintain a level of lore accuracy to the game and therefore not allow players to make evil characters like orcs in a separate faction. They would also have to have spent a great amount of time making new areas and new storylines. Now, the big perk of this is you never have faction imbalance issues. But if you want to do PvP in this game, you'll have to create a second character with the monster play feature. The monsters have unique classes of their own that don't mirror the classes of the 3 people, and this character you can only have exclusively for PvP because there is a PvP zone called the Etam Moors, which is a permanent PvP zone where you capture and defend bases. There's a ranking system, a currency that can be turned into players' more powerful character temporarily like a troll or a ranger, and other special items. I've not had a chance to experience this myself, but experienced players have described it to me, and from what I can work out, it's basically a permanent AV battleground with way more features and creativity. But honestly, over LOTRO's lifetime, there hasn't been much development into the PvP side of this game. It is more of a PvE focused game, which is kind of a shame. I think the game would be much cooler if they just added battlegrounds where all players can just go against all players if they don't have to make a separate monster character. This is honestly the most fun I've had in an MMO for years, probably since I played the Nastari server back in the day. Fair enough, this might just be because it's a fresh experience for me and I'm obsessed with Lord of the Rings, but I've said it once and I'll say it again. Vanilla LOTRO feels like Vanilla WoW on steroids. I just feel like I'm playing a more expanded version of Vanilla WoW in a Lord of the Rings universe, almost like Classic Plus. Everything I like about Vanilla WoW is in Vanilla Lord of the Rings Online. The problem with LOTRO is that it released at the worst possible time an MMO could release, because it released during the rise of World of Warcraft becoming the absolute titan of the gaming industry with 13 million active subscribers. We saw many good MMOs just come and go during this era because WoW was just so dominant. If a Lord of the Rings MMO released tomorrow with the design features that Vanilla Lord of the Rings Online has, With a few modernizations and up-to-date graphics, it would definitely be a very popular game. Significantly more popular than live LOTRO anyway, which, let's be honest, is just in cash cow survival mode, taking advantage of people who are, first of all, have too much money to spend, and they are just too addicted and over-invested into the game. LOTRO really isn't bringing in new players. When I saw that they'd recently released a new expansion, I thought, well, at least they keep updating the game to keep players playing. But I was shocked when I found out that the new expansion isn't even an endgame expansion. They just added a new way to level up in the game, and there hasn't been any new endgame raid content for 1.5 years. When the expansions come out, they are pretty lackluster, costing £30, but having as much content as one typical MMO patch update. Not to mention the absolutely insane, shameless elements they have with their deluxe editions. They've teased an engine and graphical remaster, but it still hasn't happened. It's a shame really, because I think LOTRO would have been better off if, when the development company changed to the sibling company SSG, they should have just re-released the game with all the old content exactly like Blizzard did with Classic WoW. Roll the clocks back, do Shadows of Angmar, do Mines of Moria, etc, etc. Re-release and polish the game when it actually was in its prime. Because Legendary servers really didn't do this properly. Because imagine playing Classic WoW with retail WoW classes and class changes. I mean, it just wouldn't feel right. And then they could have actually focused on releasing a new LOTRO MMO, or let a bigger studio do it. Amazon very nearly started work on a Lord of the Rings MMO, but it luckily got cancelled. Now the reason why I say this is lucky is because just look at New World and the Rings of Power. You know, that's what's come out of Amazon recently. Nonetheless, Vanilla LOTRO is a very unappreciated and simply unknown MMO. Most people didn't get a chance to play LOTRO in its glory, probably because they were playing World of Warcraft instead, okay? Me included. I'm on that bus. Because pre-free-to-play model, Lord of the Rings Online was an absolutely solid and great and popular MMO. This had a lot of players back in the day. But again, I think this largely just dwindled because World of Warcraft just became so insanely popular. Luckily, this Echoes of Angmar project exists for us to experience the game in its prime. If you want info on how to play the project, you know, links will always be in the description. But bear in mind, this project is still in development. It hasn't been fully released. There hasn't yet been a full-on server launch. We're still in beta, so there are server crashes and issues. You know, the server, for instance, was down for 3 days the other day. Don't expect to be able to make this project your new MMO. You'll be able to enjoy it for a couple of weeks before you run out of stuff to do, because they are slowly releasing more and more content for us to test. The key word being here is test, not play. This isn't a fully polished and released project yet. But nonetheless, on every major update on the beta, I'll be playing avidly and streaming it on my Twitch, which is also in the description, by the way. Anyway guys, I think after recording that video, I also need to grab myself a beer. Anyway, my name is MetaGoblin. Until my next video, ciao.